Thank you, Gary, first of all, for inviting me here to let me do this. I will say that this was a little bit intimidating. I look out here and just see some just absolutely talented woodworkers that just blow my mind every time I just see some simple boxes, and those aren't simple to me. So I hope I can do this justice. Gary did say that we want to treat this that nobody's seen a router table before. So I'm probably going to do some repetitive things that you already know. Chime in if I say something wrong. Like I said, I've been doing woodworking for quite some time. So maybe there's some things that I do that other people do that are differently. So I'm just going to start and jump right in. So the very first thing that I want to start with here is talking about the anatomy. What is a router table? Really, it's a table. We got a router mounted inside it. Typically consists of some sort of a stand, be it a floor model, maybe it's a bench model. And you have a router mounted on the underside of this, typically with some sort of a plate. Varying, some router tables out there may actually mount it to the bottom of the table. Some of the better router tables you can mount to a plate so I can remove the router in and out of there or interchange it with different routers and things like that. I actually have what they call a router lift in here right now. And what this does, as opposed to when you mount a regular router into a table, you're using the base of the router to change your height adjustment. Going from experience, sometimes that can be difficult because you loosen your router up and it wants to fall. Some better routers nowadays, when you loosen it up, you can adjust it from the top. What this does with putting a plate in there allows me to remove the motor from its base, mount it into the lift, and now all I have to do is use the lift to change my height. Really, really good precision adjustability when you're using something like this. This lift actually as well, this is made by Incra, can accommodate a wide variety of different size routers. What's nice about that, with the different cams that they use on the underside of this, I could go from a small 2 1/4, 1 3/4 horsepower router to a 3 1/4 horsepower large production router, all within the same lift, just by making some adjustments on the underside of that. So great addition to your router table. And you can also lock your spindle. So when that's locked, I can't move or change the height of this. So again, locks it in place. And again, if I want to make a slight adjustment, one turn of the circle is a 1/16 of an inch. If I just moved it an 1/8 of a turn, I just changed the height on this by 1/128 of an inch, or one 1/128 of an inch. So that's the kind of precision that you can get on that. Another thing on a router table is your fence. Sometimes used, sometimes not. So when I get into some of the things, we'll show you the differences of why you want to use this on there as well. Some of the big things that you get into router tables and all of woodworking, we got to talk safety. Number one thing, we want to all do this for fun, but we want to do this again tomorrow without hurting ourselves. So always using safety glasses of some sort. Hearing protection is good. Dust protection, dust extraction and things like that, as well as things such as feather boards and stuff like that. Variety of different push sticks that you can use on here. Push sticks like this work great. I love this little push stick right here because it gives me a solid back. So when I'm pushing wood through my router table, I can push it with that and it's not going to slide on me. So I really like using this. And again, I'll show you some examples of where I might use that. So all safety equipment all the time when you're using that. And keep in mind, something as simple as dust collection is safety as well. You don't want accumulation of dust on the floor. You're turning, you don't want to be slippery. You want to make sure you're maintaining safety at all times. So using dust collection not only makes it safe on the floor, but also makes it very safe when you are, it keeps the things clean too. So you're not making a mess on your table. So another addition, and I did see, I think I saw one on the back here in their store here. A great addition to a router table as well is either building a cabinet underneath your router table or just putting yourself a dust collection box. So you see sometimes they're metal boxes, sometimes they're wooden boxes that surrounds the underside of your router. That way you can put a dust extractor on there, and it's not only you're sucking the dust on the back of the fence, but it's also pulling down. Really great way to add to your router table, to add that onto there. So what is the difference? I mean, we all know what a router is, right? Everybody's seen a router. Great. I mean, you can't do woodworking without a router, I don't believe. So what is the difference between using a router handheld versus in a table? Probably the primary difference, a table can tend to be a little bit safer. You're running a router by hand. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with that. So a router table can be a little bit safer. Also, typically, if I got a small block of wood, maybe that's too small, but even a small block of wood, trying to do that with a handheld router can be a little bit daunting, especially if you're not used to it and you're using a larger router. Being able to take this to my router table, it's much easier to control. Again, it's very safe for doing that. Also, we talked about dust collection. If you've used a router at home and you're using it by hand, yeah, there's all kinds of little gadgets you can try to prevent the dust. But I don't know about you guys, but I always get a mouthful of sawdust when I'm using a hand router. I mean, it does blow a lot of dust. So again, a router table can prevent some of that. So other things that you can't typically do with a handheld router is routing with some of these extremely large bits. Not something you're going to want to do in a handheld router. Even though we get people that ask and want to do these things by hand, this is the kind of bit that you want to use in a router table. There's a lot of steel spinning right there. These can be very dangerous. You're not wanting to do this with a handheld router. So you're always going to be using these in a router table. So again, that's some of the things. There's also some types of things you can do on a router table that you can't do with a hand held router. This can be a joiner. And I'll show you here shortly. If you don't have a joiner at home, you could use your router table as a joiner. So there are different things you can do with this. You also can do like stile and rail for raised panel doors and things like that. You're going to be doing that on a router table as well. So when I look at setting up my router table, very first thing we talked about was installing my router. In this case, we're installing it into a lift. We are also either that or we're putting it on the underside of my table. If you're using it without a lift, again, you're using the router base as the holding up or installing your router to the table, either in a plate or on the underside of your table. Installing the bits. This is one that I think a lot of people, we get a lot of questions about this. Even in my store, I get some people in my team using a router table, and I call them gorillas. They tend to think that when you are installing a router bit that you need to crank this down as much as you possibly can. Couldn't be further from the truth. You do not want to do that. So as we crank up my router, and you can see what it's doing here coming up, and it's exposing my collet chucks. In a router table, in a router, you typically have two wrenches on here, and I'm doing this backwards, so I hope I do this right. If you notice, as I start unscrewing this, it stops. And if you'll notice, I still can't get that out of there. So I've loosened this, right? But it's still stuck in there. And that's why you don't need to really crank down on there. It's going to take one more little, just that little bit more. And now I can pull that bit out of there. So the router chucks have the ability to hold that in there. So those are, so again, when you're installing that, you don't need to really crank these down too hard. If you'll notice on any kind of a router bit, you typically, some of them have some paint on there and things like that. You can use that if you haven't worn the paint off yet as a guide to how far you put your router bit in there. One of the things that I was always taught is you leave about 1/8 of an inch between the bottom of the cutter and on the shank of where you put it into your collet. You don't want to put that all the way down in there. You want to leave that up there. What happens as I tighten down on this, on my collet here, is it's actually pulling that bit down a little bit. And again, just a little snug. We don't need to really crank down on it. And now that's not going anywhere. But it's actually pulling that bit in. So again, just gentle tug on that and you're ready to go. You can seize that router bit in there. When you're cutting, this is generating heat. And I've had people bring routers back to our store because their bits are literally seized inside there. You know, you can get a little bit of PB blaster and try to loosen it up and things like that. But yeah, you don't want that bottoming out on there. There are people, and I've not tried this, that have used like little space balls. They'll drop in there. The little rubber balls they'll drop in the bottom to prevent the bit from bottoming out inside there. Don't go by that by me, but I have heard that some people do that as well. Yes, sir. So he had suggested that it could be a safety issue. Do not want that bit bottoming out. So he suggested buying some sort of a foam, cutting yourself a little chunk of foam that you can drop in there again, to prevent the bit from bottoming out on the bottom of the.
If the bit bottoms out, you can't get it tight.
Yep, because it's not pulling it down. Correct. You'll see me, I pulled this piece out. These are designed to fit around the router bit. If I'm working with this router and I have this large opening and I'm running a piece of wood across here, you know, there's a chance that this could get wedged down there and things like that. So all the tables will come with a variety of different size plates that you can put in there to fit around a variety of bits. We were talking about this early. This particular lift uses metal plates with magnets holding it in there. It's really convenient. However, they're metal. We don't want to get our router bit too close to those. So there are other manufacturers of these out there that'll make them out of plastic, make them out of phenolic and things like that. Just be aware that you don't want a real small, tight bit around that. I want to make sure I give myself a little bit of extra room. So this one's a little bit bigger. And again, that'll prevent my wood from getting jammed down in there. So again, that's why they have a wide variety of these on there. And some people sell these for their tables that are blank. So I could make a zero clearance a plate or insert plate for the specific router bit that I'm using. So again, this one is held in with magnets. It's very convenient. But like I said, you do have to be aware that you are using metal on here as well. Collet sizes. We all know that we have a router in there, and most commercially available, better routers are going to come with can fit 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch shanked router bits. A lot of people ask, what is the real difference? If I have my choice between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch, I typically lean towards 1/2 inch. And the price typically is not that much different between the same bit and a 1/4 inch versus 1/2 inch. But a larger shank bit is going to be just a little bit more durable. We get people coming in, they want to use a bit like that with a 1/4 inch shank. That's dangerous. So, I mean, there are people that make them. I actually own one that's like that. It scares the heck out of me. So again, that strength is in that thing. This thing could spin at, 12 to 23,000 RPMs. Do I really want that? I mean, that's a hunk of steel. I don't want to take a chance. So again, I always side on the bigger bits. Now there are smaller bits that you can't get in a 1/2 inch just due to the size. But again, if you always are looking at the difference between the two and you have the router that can handle it, go for 1/2 inch shank bits. They're definitely going to make your day a lot better. But again, most routers do come with at least the ability to upgrade to 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch shanks, and it can change them in and out. Feed direction. So when you are feeding a router, you're always going right to left. I know this is my left on this, but to yours, we're always feeding this way. We're always going, because this bit is spinning counterclockwise. We want to be feeding into that bit. Running what they call a climb cut this way is a good way to throw your piece of wood across the room. I've done it. Not on purpose, but I have done it before. And that wood can, again, spinning 16,000 RPMs, that can really shoot a piece of wood pretty good. And not to mention, it screws up your nice piece of wood. So you're always feeding. And by the way, this is just a finger guard that is designed to go over top of your router bit for safety purposes. For today, we're going to remove that just so you guys can see what's going on here a little bit better. So if I am setting my router table up or my router fence up on here, and I'm feeding my bit across here, I'm always feeding it this way because this bit's spinning this way, and I'm feeding it into the cutter on that. So how do I set up my router table? If you'll notice right now, I've got this piece a little tight within there. So I'm going to adjust these pieces of wood out. Now, so I'm going to spread that apart. Now, there have been times, because these are just MDF, you can buy replacements or make replacements in there, that I've literally fed that into my bit and made a zero clearance, just like you do on a table saw. You can make zero clearance right on your router table. Or you can leave these together like this and feed your fence in there. Just be careful, be aware of it, and, have something, so keeping your hands away from it. But again, I could make zero clearance on that. I don't usually do that. It'd just be extreme reasons why I'm going to do that. But again, I'm going to keep that fairly close. So again, same reason we did with the plate, we want to leave that at a distance like that. How I set up any kind of bit. Now we're using an edge bit on here. So this is a round over bit that we are going to be doing edging on this piece of wood. If I wanted to cut a bead or a round over on a piece of wood, and I'm going to be feeding it in this way, I want to set my fence up flush with my bearing. Nah, maybe not all the time, because maybe I'm not going to use the full use of that. But typically I'm going to rub this and keep my bearing right on the fence. So a lot of times I'll just take myself a little straight edge like this, and I'll put it on the bearing and just bring the table up, or the fence up to that, and lock it in place. So now I know when I bring my piece across there, I'm going to be straight. I'm not going to have any snipe on the back side because of the differences between the way the router bit is sitting with the fence. Another thing that I want to point out on a router table, this fence does not need to be parallel. I could have it sitting like that and still cutting the same. I've got a center point that I'm working off of. As long as I'm working it this way, that fence does not need to be perfect. Now, granted, we want to make sure we're centered around the bit like that. But again, if I'm just setting this up, I could have this setting this way. It doesn't matter. There are times when this fence does need to be parallel to your miter slot. That's when you're using a miter gauge. Other than that, that fence could sit anywhere on there again, because you're working with a center point on there. So that's not a critical thing. Typically, though, most of us, when we're going to set up this in our shop, we're going to get it close. But I don't need to bring out a tape measure and measure the distance here or anything like that. I know that, again, if I just put this on my bit and bring that in like that, tighten it up, right there, and I'm good to go. So again, that is typically how you're setting your fence up on your router table. He did mention my bit's a little bit high. And again, it depends on how I'm cutting and what I want to cut on here. Um, a lot of times I'm just using the profile, whether I'm doing this with a hand, and I'm going to bring that in, to make a cut like that. Depending on the router table and the router table fence. A simple router table fence like this, these are one solid piece across here. You can get into better router fences that are independent of one another and allows you to adjust for that. In the case of this particular router table, I'm going to loosen this a little bit and I'm going to push that out with my knobs in the back. This particular router table comes with these little bars. When I use the top and the third notch in my fence, I have moved that fence outward a 1/16 of an inch. In the back, and just for you guys that can't see this, I'm going to spin this table a little bit. You'll see those notches in here. So 1 and 3 brings this out a 1/16 of an inch. If I put these into hole number 2 and number 4, I've now pushed that out a 32nd of an inch. So that allows me to bring that out. Why would I do that? I would do that in a case where he says, I'm not using a bearing. Well, let's say we want to use, I mentioned earlier, we could use a router table as a joiner. So I could take a bit such as a beast like this. It's a really big bit. I can chuck that into my table and use this and set this up to cut a 1/16 of an inch off of here when I feed that through, because I've now removed that edge. If I have this set up correctly, that edge will now be supported across there. And I'm not going to get snipe on that back side of that cut. What he means by snipe, if you're not familiar with that, that's at the end of a cut. A lot of times you're familiar with it in a planer, leaves a little divot on the back of the cut, because what happens is that board shifts backwards when it's not being supported by the infeed table. So that's what they mean by snipe. By moving this fence outward this way, I now have adjusted for that snipe. And it allows me now, I could use my router table as a joiner. And a 1/16 of an inch is probably a lot to even take off in one pass. So I might side more with a 32nd of an inch cut, because I don't typically need to cut that much off of there. Make 2 passes if I needed to cut 2/16 of an inch off. Another thing that's really nice about a router table like this is putting it on wheels. If you're not a person that has a whole lot of room in their home shop, having things on wheels is definitely a great advantage. I share my shop with my wife, so I don't have the luxury of leaving things set up all day long. Fence set up, we set that up. And again, I mentioned before the use of feather boards. Why would I want to use a feather board on here? Put my board in here and put a little bit of, I don't have to hold that down, just a little slight pressure on there and lock that in place. So now when I'm feeding my board through, I don't have any chance that that's going to lift up on me as I'm making my cut. Use one on the outfeed and do the same thing. So as I feed my board through, put this over here, as I feed my board through, just a little bit of down pressure to put a little bit of stress on that. And again, as it's going to be held in place. Another type of feather board that could be used as well is a table feather board. I could put this in my miter slot on here, not only hold the bit downward, but I'm going to hold it in a place as I feed it through so it does not drift away from the fence. So if I was to use this with this, and feather board's kind of tight, I'm gonna put a little forward pressure on that. And now as I feed that through, it's being held down, it's being held against the fence. Again, a great way to be safe while you're routing. Limit your hands to getting too close. You're not trying to put a lot of pressure down. And another tip, you never want to run your hand over the bit. So you always want to feed and pick it up on the other side. But again, using a jig like this allows me to feed this through. I know I've got this against the fence. I think I got my feather board just a little tight here. Being held against the fence, I could feed my cut through there and not have to worry about my hands and keeping myself nice and safe. So safety, feather boards as well. Now, there are times that I may make a cut on my router table. I'm gonna take these off a second. That, let's say I wanted to make something like that on a router table. Wouldn't want to do this with a hand. And again, it's be a case where we might have to adjust our outfeed table for something like that. But if I'm making that, I want to keep my hands away from that hunk of steel spinning. So I might use a feather board like that, a stacked feather board. So now when I put that in my table, and I've got that, my piece of wood now is supported vertical as I'm being pushing that through there. So now when I'm going to make a cut with something like that, that I've got plenty of support on my wood going through there. That's a scary bit right there. But again, it can be done on a router table, and using feather boards such like this. I always say sandwiching your board in there will keep that and running it nice and smooth on there. So one of the things that I always look at, especially I've got a piece of cherry here. What happens to cherry? Burns. You know, and how do you prevent that? Honestly, I don't know how you prevent it, but you got to live with it. So you'd make steps to do that. So what would I do to make a cut with cherry on my wood that prevents or minimizes burning, or let's say minimizes the or how do I fix it? Maybe that's great lead into the new guy that's going to teach you how to fix things. So when I am going to make this cut, the first thing is how fast am I feeding it? Cherry, maple, very, they burn. They love to burn. Keep the piece moving. You don't want to make a cut and stop in the middle. I guarantee if we make a stop in the middle, I'm going to burn this. However, another thing that I do, I always say, first of all, I'm not a production guy. I'm not in the business of hurrying when I'm doing things in my shop. So I do side with taking light passes. That's how one way you can minimize burning on a router table. Now, look at that. You guys can see what I'm doing right here, sort of. Well, I'm just going to make a cut here with this. I think I need to lower this a little bit. Well, like I said, I creep up on my cut. There's no need to really take a big gouge with that. Not only could it burn it, it might chip out and stuff like that. All right, so we got everything set here. I'm locked. I'm good. My fence is clear, and I've got dust collection. So I'm going to make a cut. We talk about speed. Since I did that, let me talk about the speed of my router bits. Most manufacturers of router bits are going to give you a recommended speed setting. I've got a Freud case here, and it's telling me on here, if I'm using a bit 1 inch to running at 24,000 RPMs, 3.5 inch running at 12,000 RPMs. These are not necessarily locked in place. Do you really need to run this thing 24,000 RPMs on a small bit? Usually you don't. You know, slow the speed down a little bit. I do a lot of my cuts based upon how this thing sounds. I'm going to turn this router on. I'm going to pull it up to full speed, and I'm going to take it down. you can almost start getting a feel for where your speed needs to be depending on your bits. So turn this on without the vac. That's pretty quiet. That's pretty soft. You don't need to. You can leave it right there. That's a small bit. According to that, I can run that at 24,000 RPMs. Right now, I'm probably at about 16,000 RPMs. Just slow it down just a little bit more. Oh, I didn't even burn it. I tried to burn it there so you could see this. Nice smooth speed. And I'm going to stop in the middle a second. I still didn't burn it. I was actually trying to burn it there. But again, you can kind of see what I didn't have at full speed on there. Nice. I got a nice smooth cut on there. I'm going to raise this up a little bit more to make another cut just to get it a little bit more so you can kind of get an idea. And let's raise it up so we get a bit of the corner of the bit there. And a little bit of a burn mark there. A little bit of a burn mark, not much. That's because I stopped there on purpose on that. So what do I do to minimize that? I'm just going to take this again with a lift. It's a much easier, but on a router table, you just raise your bit up a skosh. What's a skosh? 64th of an inch or something like that. Lock my spindle. And turn this on. And you can see I put a little bit of a bead on that, but a nice smooth thing. I took that burn mark right out of there. So again, the answer to that is minimizing burning, keep it moving, take light passes, and do a finish pass at the very end. One other tip, and I tell this to everybody, no matter what kind of woodworking, and I'm sure a lot of you guys understand this because I heard it earlier, make test cuts. Don't get all your cherry out there and start cutting. These are my finished pieces, and I'm going to get it some scrap. Mill your scrap to the same sizes of your finished product. Now, when I do all my setups on there and you get that to work, that's your setup block. So now when I need to come back to that, I can take that piece, set it on my table. That's the height I'm going to be, lower the skosh, make my cut, come back to that height, and I make that cut real quick. Real simple way to do cuts on there. So I talked about using the fence. And I mentioned earlier, there might be times that you will not use the fence. What would that be? Well, there are times that I need to make a cut on maybe rounded stock or something like that. And I'm going to actually come back to that because what I wanted to show you guys, and I got a piece of rounded stock we could test it on. But first, before we do that, this would be another reason that I may not use a fence. I'm going to do a pattern cut. Remove my fence. Thanks, sir. And now I'm free and clear on here. There is an item, put it in my pocket, that most router tables and plates come with. It's a starting pin. What the starting pin does is it mounts on either side of my blade, but sort of takes the place of your fence. So it gives me support. So if I want to cut this piece, I want to do a pattern cut with this. And if you notice me looking down there, I'm making sure my router's unplugged. Again, safety. I know it sounds stupid, but that thing's spinning a hunk of steel in there. I don't want my fingers near that. I don't want that coming on. This here is a piece of corner of an Adirondack chair, kind of cut down a little bit. But let's say we are following a pattern. What I did initially is I cut this on the bandsaw. I don't want that, you know, that bandsaw doesn't do a great cut, but it gets you started. You know, I'm about 1/8 of an inch before the line. So what I'm going to do is I want to follow this pattern to cut that. Usually use some sort of a double-sided tape. Will hold your pattern on there. And we can. We actually, Rockler does sell that for a couple different manufacturers of those. So yeah, you're not having to reach down in there. My router at home's an old Porter cable, and it actually has a button on the side. So I only need one wrench. Porter cable's no longer around, so unfortunately, you can't sell that. But yeah, there's quite a few ways that you can get those. And like I said, I know Rockler does sell them for like the old Porter cables, Bosch. What's the other one we have? DeWalt would be the ones that we have on there. All right, so we're gonna bring that in there. I'm gonna raise that up just a little bit. And this is a pattern bit. Some people call it flush trim. It just depends. Typically, a flush trim looks like that with the bearing closer to the base, where a pattern bit's up on top. And the reason, well, actually, in my router table, this becomes a pattern bit. Ordinarily, if I was using it in a handheld router, that would be a flush trim. So I kind of, because I'm going backwards, this would be typically a pattern bit in a handheld router, but on a router table, it's more of a flush trim bit. So it's kind of a interesting way. And you could also look at bits, something like that. You got best of both worlds. And if you also notice on this bit, it is kind of at an angle. It shows this one on here. That's a shearing bit, so it gives you a cleaner cut when you're cutting. So again, that's just something that I've noticed. And I got double-sided tape on there, and I'm going to put my pattern on here. I want to bring this down. But what I mentioned is my router may not go down low enough to accommodate that height of a bit. It may be okay. All right, I think I got it. Yep, we're good. So now that bearing is riding on my pattern. So now when I want to make that cut, let's grab a inset plate. We don't need no stinking tape measure. We just come down here and we look at it. So actually, I want to make sure too that the cutter, I'm not on, right, is cutting my piece of wood. So I want to get that a little bit higher. So it's riding the bearing, and again, my cutter will cut the wood. Got that to the right height. Let's lock it. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to spin this back around. I could use my starting pin as I'm cutting this. So I'm going to feed this into this, and I'm using that pin right there to kind of support it. So as I feed into that, I'm going to get that. I'm trying to keep this away from you a little bit. I don't want to get too close to you because I have no dust collection on this when I do this. But again, that starting pin is going to allow me to put that in there. Now, if you'll notice, if I come to the end, that starting pin is going to bleed a little bit. So I may stop there and come back in and feed it that way. So I'm going to do, yeah, I was just noticing that as I, see, trying to do this backwards. It's, yeah, when I, so I said, I'm trying to do this flipped around and now I come back. So now there we go. That's going to make that much easier. So, Thank you. That's why I'm here. I'm learning as much as you guys are teaching me. All right. Absolutely. Again, that speed, according to these instructions, tell me to run it at 24,000 RPMs. I don't need to do that. So again, I'm just going to keep it slow. Uh, make sure we're good and good. All right. Don't have a dust collector on because I can't do anything. This is where a dust collection box underneath your router can come into play, because I don't have a fence for dust collection, but a box underneath will minimize some of that dust that's going to be created. My bit's still just a little bit too low. So the reason when I'm having that little lip is because the distance between the cutter and the bearing is about maybe a 16th of an inch. So if I don't get that up at the right height, I'm leaving myself that little bit of a cut on there. So as I sit safely here in the boat, my helper Jim will. My height of my bit is still off a hair. Well, I think what's happening with my bearing may be moving on me. Actually, my bit's moving on me. All right, so that's one reason you don't do what I just did. Well, I think you guys get the idea of what I'm doing with the flush trim bit in doing that on there. So I'm just going to take that bit out of there. I just didn't finish it up all the way to the edge. Can remove that off of my double-sided tape if you can get it off of there. Good double-sided tape, hard to get off. And again, now I have my profile on there. So let's say, for example, that I want to, again, using the pin. I don't think I had that tight.
You were distracted.
I was distracted. See. So another safety tip, don't do woodworking while you're distracted. Let's take a chamfer bit and we'll put it in there. And this time we'll make sure it's nice and tight. There is one thing that I love about woodworking. When you're in your shop and you're doing this kind of stuff, I forget about the world around me. I mean, I really do. I enjoy this. All the problems of the world just disappear and I concentrate on doing woodworking. It just relaxes you. I just do love that. So again, if I had my bit in here and without a fence, and this is just a piece of poplar, and I made sure my bit was tight again. So using my starting pin, again, I'm feeding it. The bit is running this way, so I'm feeding it right to left and across that bit. You can see the burning I'm getting on there because I'm going slow. This is a great time to use things like your push blocks. So again, I made that a little deeper than I might have wanted to, but again, you could see why I cleaned it up a little bit, made it much easier. And again, he said would be 2 pins work at the same time. I don't see why not, as long as it doesn't prohibit you being able to turn your piece. Yep, yep, absolutely. So again, I probably took a little much on that, but again, you can see what we did by using that starter pin. All right. Any more questions on what kind of whatever? Yes, sir.
Never take a small piece like you were dealing with there and depend on my fingers getting that close to the router bit. I would, if you got a long board, a 3-foot board or something, that's a different story. But a small piece like you were dealing with there and the chance of it getting away from you and your fingers sliding into the bit. So a cautionary point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why these are great. Use them all the time. I just didn't use it that time. And again, I preach safety. that is definitely one of the ways of doing it. What about cutting end grain? We want to cut this on the entire circumference of that piece of wood. So the problem that you run into is, especially when you're cutting across the end grain, is it's going to blow out that corners. There's a couple ways you can minimize that. One is to use a sacrificial piece around it. Another way to minimize it is, well, again, you're never going to minimize it so much, but you can work with it, I should say. Cut all your end grains first. So if you get blowout, it's going to blow out. You're typically going to come back on your straight grain, and it's going to clean up that blowout. So using a sacrificial piece with it, we could do that. So this might be a case where on a router table that you may want to use your miter gauge as well. So using my miter gauge in my piece of wood, something you never do on a table saw is use your fence with your miter gauge. Here, my miter gauge is supporting my wood. Now, if I come back and using my nifty straight thing here, and we're going to mark this so my bit is actually not even on the fence. I've kept that away from that. Now, as I feed this into here, it's going to pull that away from the fence, but I'm not concerned about that because I'm riding that bearing. So I'm going to leave that just as is. Now I'm going to make my cross cut. I'm going to use my router table or my miter gauge to make the cut on my end grains first. Like I said, I could use a sacrificial fence or something behind that, but I'm going to show you what we would do should we. So if you'll notice on these, I got blowout on there. That you can see right here on this corner where I got the blowout on there. Likewise on that side, I got that little bit of blowout. So because I did my end grains first, now I'm going to come back with my straight grain. Again, I'm not concerned that this fence is not up with that bearing because I'm riding the bearing. And now I'm going to make this cut. And now I've got nice clean cut. Kept it moving so there's no burn marks and things like that, sir. Yes, sir. Honestly, I've never done climb cuts on my end cuts to minimize tear out. Is that work? I mean, is that a suggested?
Done it. Well, it's a grain situation, right?
Mhm.
So I've done it in situations where I know if I run it through, it's going to chip out. And so, if you,
I'd be willing to give it a try.
I go really, really slow and
it depends on
not
the wood,
charging
I'm
in
sure,
there.
too. I mean,
Yeah.
this is poplar, so it's a little softer.
Mhm.
Maybe you get into some other woods, but that's not a technique that I'm familiar with.
Oh, okay.
So just real quickly, what I've experienced is, like mentioned here, I'll go and I'll make about a 1/4 of an inch climb cut at the beginning on the far side, then go back and I make the cut on the end grain the way you conventionally would. That clears out the space to help minimize blowout. So if you're not going to go back and do the side grain,
Yep.
that works well, and it's just a really small climb cut. It's safe if you're just in there for a little teeny bit, just 1/4 inch is all you need.
Go back to the curved piece you were doing.
Yes, sir.
The cut you made initially was going against the grain. So you're going to get a very rough surface on the curve.
Yes, if you feel
That's a
that is
place
pretty-
for a climb cut.
Okay.
If you do that with a climb cut, it'll be very
You see,
smooth.
I should know that
But
because
it's
on a
dangerous.
CNC, they tell you to
Yeah.
do that to minimize that on end grain. So, yeah,
Or you put your template on the other side.
Yeah, right.
yeah,
Sometimes you can't do that.
Yeah,
Sometimes the
definitely.
climb cut's the only way.
sure.
Another thing is safety wise. You haven't done it, you haven't mentioned it yet, but set it up where you put the the straight piece of wood between the bit and the fence
And
to
feed
show it.
this way.
Yeah. Don't ever do that.
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
no.
But I was encouraging you to say that. Don't ever do it that way. It's
Correct.
dangerous.
Absolutely. I actually had a customer come in and he was, I can't remember the specific circumstance, but he was having a problem in it. And all of a sudden, as he explained how he was using his router table, I got cold chills because he was bringing his wood like a table saw. He was running the bit between the fence and feeding it this way.
How many fingers did he have?
Ah, you know, luckily he still had 10, I believe. Yeah, none of this, but no, excellent point. No, right to left, always have your bit near your fence, always feeding it that way. You don't want to take a chance of, and the worst case scenario, or not worst case, but one scenario could happen. You could, that piece again, that could take off across the shop. So definitely a great point. So
The thing is when it takes off across the shop and jerks your hand with it.
that's something you don't want to happen. Leave the wood alone, drop the wood. And you know, the miter gauges come with these, you know, typically holes in there. You make sacrificial fences on there, you can make them all day. Some of the cuts, I'm not going to get into, we talked about template cutting, but we talked about small pieces. Jigs like this work great. I don't know many people cut and route that small of pieces, but there are jigs like this allow you to hold that against that and make that cut. So wanted to point that out to you. Wide variety of these out there, and I've even seen homemade ones. But again, great things. Keep your fingers away from that bit at all costs. Another cut that is probably one of the most popular cuts that we run into on using a router table is they call them the cope and stick, the style and rail cuts that you do on a router table. Typically going to fit something like that. Makes a beautiful door joint, makes a great gluing surface if you're making paneled doors. Now this is a pretty simple one with a, we call this the shaker style. But you can get a wide variety of profiles. I'm going to remove, no, I want to leave it there. I'm going to turn this back around, show you a simplified version of how I do my razor style and rail. I always start, and you guys could help me here. Is this the cope or the stick cut? I always forget. But I always make my end cut first. I make them this way. Two reasons. One, it's easier to set up my other cut. But second of all, again, if I get any blowout on this as well, then I minimize because I'm going to cut this on this end by cutting that cut with that bit. Once I set that up in my router table and I've got these pieces cut, I come back with the mating piece and I line that tongue up with that what do we call it's the slot cutter. I line that up with that and it hasn't failed me yet. I mean, I can put that on there and I can actually bring my bit and I can just feel so it's flush with that and I get a perfect joint just about every time. Again, make test cuts. Once you get it working, there's your setup block. You got it again, right on their setup block. Now, next time I want to use that bit. Now, another thing I mentioned earlier, who needs a tape measure, right? How do I set that height of that bit to make that cut? Honestly, that is just what's aesthetically pleasing for the cut that I'm doing. I don't want to leave a whole lot there. So I'm going to leave just because I want to see that nice chamfer on the edge of that thing. So I'm going to set that up to what looks good for me. But I also want to make sure I don't want to leave this too thin on the back because I am going to put, in a case with this, I might use just a flat panel or a panel. I want to make sure that I'm leaving enough there. I don't want this breaking out of me. So that'd probably be about the minimum that I would make the back of that when I'm cutting that. Now, when I come back and I set up for my next cut, I'm going to do all my inside edges with that bit, with the slot that's cutting in there. And again, I get a nice joint. Now, one thing I don't care about this particular joint that I just made this yesterday is my tongue is a little bit loose. I want this a little bit tighter. And that can be adjusted, especially on these Freud bits. These Freud bits are, if you haven't seen these style and rail bits, they have bushings or washers in here that allow me to change the thickness of my, what do we call it? My tenon cut there. And also change the width of how far I want to make that tenon on that side as well. Great for any wood from 5/8 up to 1.25 inches thick, maybe even 1 3/8 inches. So I can make wider ones with these bits, all because I can change the height of that. Now, I just took this straight out of the package and made that. And I noticed that these are a little bit close together. So I'd probably put a washer in there. That way, when I make this cut, that would be not so loose in there. This would work. And again, I'll be able to make that work. A lot of glue area on here as well. That's what makes this joint so great. I'm not really gluing end grain when I put that. I've got a lot of flat grain here that I'm gluing, so I got a very strong joint. Another tip, you ever glue in your panel? No, because you need that to move in there. It's free. We mentioned space balls before. I loved your idea using the little chunks of foam because they, you put little foam or space ball, which are little rubber balls, you put in there, that holds the panel in there, but gives it a little bit of movement. So if it's movement for the weather, and that holds that panel nice and tight. We don't want to shut a door and hear it rattle. So we want to put that in there. So what's the other portion of this cut that you would do would be a raised panel. I could use a bit like that for making a raised panel. Yeah, we'll just use a small piece of wood like that. If I was making and cutting this with a raised panel on there, obviously I want to make the thickness of that to fit into the groove of my rail and style cutters that I already made. However, if I did that with a 3/4 inch thick piece of wood, this piece of wood's going to be up here. It's going to stand proud of the doors. If that's the look you're going for, great. But a lot of times you want to have a back cutter on the back side of this. In this case, with this, my back, I would cut a rabbet on the back of this door, the thickness of whatever I made that. So now whenever I put my door, my panel into that, it's going to sit flush with my door. Another way you could do it is you could use a bit like this, virtually the same type of bit, but this has a back cutter on it. So this is going to adjust for that. So now I can use this cutter at the same time as both of them. A lot of wood to be cutting at the same time. The problem with using a bit, if it is a problem, like this, I can't make multiple passes raising that up because it would change the way the back cutter works. This bit, I can make multiple passes and come up to the depth that I need. So with a bit like this, in order to minimize the tear out of what you might get running in that, move your fence. Make light passes leading it into this. And, it can minimize the tear out and things like that you could get with that. So I tell you what, if you've never done a rail and style, this is a fun joint to make. When it works, man, you just get that. Yeah, that worked. That is really cool. So again, I love making that joint, and when it works, yes, sir.
What's the difference between a router and a shaper?
Great question. Were we talking about this today? So he asked the question, what is the difference between a router and a shaper? I'll answer this a couple different ways. I've been with Rockler 20 years. I can count on one hand how many times I've sold a shaper. Bizarre. I don't know why. In high school and shop class, we always use shapers. The real answer, I think, over the years, the quality of routers, the power of routers that are available, the quality of the router tables that you can get for the money, the router table is typically what most home shops are using. Interestingly enough, most of the shapers that I see out there also have collets to accept router bits. So in the old days, people used to say, well, I don't want a shaper because I've invested into all these router bits and now I'm going to invest into all these shaper bits. But now most of the shapers that I see available actually have a collet to accept a router bit. So now that argument's kind of out there. Usually too, some of the lower cost shapers, and I'm literally guessing right now, $1,500 shaper, the tables are like this big. They're real small. When you start getting into shapers with this size of table, you're talking $3,000-$4,000 as well. So maybe it's price prohibitive. And has anybody seen what shaper cutters cost? I mean, again, they cost a fortune. So to answer your questions, there's not a lot of difference between the two. Now, one very positive thing that I like about a shaper, typically they're going to be quieter. They're using induction motors. They're more efficient motors. They're more powerful. But also with a shaper, you're going to be using large bits. If I got to make an entry door or something, usually router bits are not going to get that big. Typically 3.5 inches is the largest router bit. And I believe shapers can get up there to a much bigger cutting as well. So, but we just don't see the market for them, maybe like they once were years ago, except commercial. We do sell them to some commercial facilities that are looking for specific shapers. And again, one of the things that I see a lot of people doing with shapers is attaching power feeders to them. So in a production atmosphere, I put a piece of wood in there, it feeds it right through. I mean, those are beautiful things, but they can be pretty massive. And you need quite a large table to be able to handle power feeders on there as well. So I want to finish up with a couple things, and real quickly is sharpening your router bits, cleaning your router bits. We do offer a service that does professional sharpening of your router bits, but you don't necessarily need to do that. You can use small diamond hones and things like that to sharpen your bits. When you sharpen a bit, you do not want to mess with the outside edge. You only want to sharpen the inside. Take this is a diamond file, set it on here, and just move it back and forth. They tell you to, make the same amount of passes on there. But again, you can clean up a bit pretty quickly with these little diamond hones. Just as we were leaving the store today, interestingly enough, we got a sample in our store. So I wasn't going to tout Rockler, but I thought this was really cool. This is a router bit cleaning kit. And what's really neat about this is it comes with this little container. You put a cleaning solution in there. I do not recommend oven cleaner. I've heard people try to do that. They say that can weaken the joints in the carbide. But using a dedicated bit or blade cleaning solution in there, put it in there, you drop some bits in there, you drop it and you let them soak. On the back side of this included is a little scrub brush. So we can use that to clean it up. Kind of a neat little thing right here. Also on the back side of this is a diamond hone. So they give you one with it. This has a coarse and medium. So again, or not coarse, medium, fine and medium on that as well. So all contained in a little thing. But also what's really neat is they comes with this holder. And this is designed to be either hold it while I'm cleaning my bit, or I can put it in a vise. If you'll notice, it comes with a collet on there to hold your bit in there, 1/2 inch, 8 millimeter and 1/4 inch. A series of wrenches to be able to remove the bearing or something off of that as well. all self-contained in a little kit like that. I thought it was pretty cool. And since we were coming here today and Gary said something about sharpening and cleaning your router bits, I said, that's the cat's meow. If you don't buy something like this, again, keeping your bits clean minimizes burning. You know, any buildup of resin or anything on the bits can cause burning. Keeping your bits nice and sharp will also minimize burning as well. What else can you do as far as keep your table clean? We talked about that, vacuuming down. Your router is sitting opposite what it's normally done. Dust gets down in there. I always take my air hose, blow that out. Get the dust out of your router. You don't want that to accumulate down in there. And another neat little thing that's out there, and I think you can get these just about anywhere, little needle oil dispensers. These are great for your bearings on your router. Just put a little drop in there. You can use this on your hinges. You can use this on your guns. You can use this on your skate wheels, whatever you want to use it on. Yes, sir.
The question was, when you're using that, should you take the bearing off? The answer is
When
yes.
you're putting it in the solution. Yes, sir. Yep.
Terrific.
And that's why on here, they give you that assortment of different wrenches to be able to remove your bearings when you're doing that. Straight bits without bearings, you're fine to go.
We asked you the impossible, which was to squeeze a comprehensive router table class into less than a couple of hours. We could probably spend a week on the subject, but very, very well done. There's one last question, I think.
On my rotor cable, I've got a quarter cable, and they make, or you can buy what is called a muffle chuck to replace the chuck on that rotor. And all it takes is an Allen wrench to loosen, to remove a bit. And I've been using this for, I would guess, over 20 years, and I've never had a bit come loose on me or move on me. And it eliminates the need for the wrench.
I have one for safe file.
You know, I just want to say thank you. You guys, you made this easy on me today. I mean,
Well,
really
thank
did.
you,
I mean,
Dan. It was a terrific, terrific time.
I was nervous.
Really well done. And thanks everyone for coming.